All right, uh, let's get started. I'm so glad everyone was able to join. This is our inaugural journal club, and we're going to talk about the journal club will cover different topics and different kinds of mind-body therapies about on a monthly basis. And for this topic, for our inaugural topic, we're going to talk about autism and mind-body therapies, a systematic review. It was recently published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. The citation is here. So the journal club goals and formats, let me just go over some logistics, I guess, for the journal club goal and format. The first goal is obviously to learn about cutting edge research, what's going on in the mind-body science field, and research literacy. When we read a paper, what is it that we really should be looking for when we're reading a paper? And I find that the more you read and the more you're exposed to, or that we're exposed to, the easier it gets. Also perspective. Oftentimes we see a lot of these articles and headlines in the news and the media, and it's easy to get carried away. But oftentimes they're reporting on a single study, and we're all subject to confirmation bias, so we see that single study and we want to believe that it's all true, but really we need to be able to look at research in perspective, because really science is a body of evidence. So the format for Journal Club is just going to be, I'm going to highlight the paper that's selected for the Journal Club, and then I open it up for Q&A. However, if you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt, and I'm happy to answer those questions. So. Okay, so first of all, what's a systematic review? We're reviewing, the paper we're talking about today is a systematic review. So a lot of times we'll hear about a randomized control trial or a cohort study or something like that. Those are all kinds of studies, and this is a systematic review that includes those kinds of studies. The systematic review synthesizes a lot of other of the studies that are out there in the field. There's usually a systematic approach, which we'll see, as opposed to other kinds of reviews where it just sort of is a more subjective narrative about what's going on in the field. There are strengths to the systematic review, and one of those is that it's a good way of getting a lot of information in us, in more bite-sized chunk. And it gives you a bird's eye view of the field. Some of the limitations, however, are if the field doesn't have a lot of good quality papers, then the systematic review or the information we're getting really is only as good as the papers that are included in that systematic review. So for this particular review, the objective was to evaluate the existing evidence for mind-body therapies for people with autism spectrum disorder, and to determine the types of mind-body therapies that people with ASD are seeking out, and to look at what outcomes were targeted. So this is casting a pretty wide net. I think that they're looking at mind-body therapies in general, as opposed to something specific like acupuncture or yoga, because there's probably not a lot of research in just any one particular modality. So I think this is a good place for them to start. The background that they provided, this is found in the introduction of the article. So they asked, why do individuals with ASD use mind-body therapies in the first place? Are they using it for treatment? Are they using it for co-occurring conditions? And was it successful? They define ASD as people with social processing skills or limited social processing skills, difficulties in understanding metaphorical or non-literal language, slower information processing, and intellectual disability. The methods for this particular systematic review are as follows. So they included autism, of course, but in addition to autism, they included people with Asperger's, and other non-specified developmental disorders. They also noted that that some papers did not have a criteria for diagnosis. So that could be, it's ambiguous, right? So if we don't actually know if there was a specific diagnosis, then we can't be sure if that person actually had autism or not. But we also know that autism is kind of hard to nail down sometimes, so that could be the reason for that. They also included any age, so that's also casting a wide net. The mind-body therapies that they included in this particular paper included anything with an attentional or mindfulness component. So they found papers with mindfulness-based interventions, meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, and acceptance and commitment therapy. The designs that they included in their study were randomized control trials, quasi-experimental, which essentially are two groups, a treatment group and a control group, but they're not randomized. And the reason for this sometimes is just it's just not possible to randomize. And then feasibility studies, which are usually only a treatment group where they take a measurement, at the beginning, pre-baseline, and then after the treatment. The search parameters, they search several databases and they use these words, autism, autism spectrum disorder, and all of these other words to, again, cast a wide net to see what they could find. And they included the search period from 1980 to 2015. And I believe that the reason they started with 1980 is because that's when they first started to note autism as a problem, and also maybe some of the research didn't really start coming out, I guess, until a little bit later. So every systematic review should have a flow chart. And the flow chart, what it tells us is basically, how they identified the records that they found in the database, and what they ended up with in terms of including it in the actual systematic search. So, I mean, this is important because sometimes we want to know, like, did they get everything, right? So you just want to make sure, did they get everything? And did they do a very thorough, a thorough job? So, I mean, without getting in the weeds here, they started out with, they identified 265 articles out there in the internet, but then they removed duplicates, they removed some that did not include, that were not within their inclusion criteria, and they tell you why they excluded them. And you can see here on the side where some were excluded because it didn't actually include ASD participants. Maybe it wasn't a mind-body intervention, maybe it wasn't in English. And then they end up with a final number below. So in this particular review, they included 3 randomized control trials, 4 quasi-experimental studies, and 9 cohort or pre-post studies. And the sample size for these, the range was between 3 subjects and 50 participants. Those aren't very large sample sizes. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of evaluating any study, really, is that the sample size carries enough weight to detect a real change. The age range was, again, 2.5 to 65 years. And they looked at a variety of outcomes. So some were measuring behavioral, social, psychological outcomes, subjective well-being of children and adults, and also in some studies they included parents. In table 2, they included a very nice description of the interventions that were included in these particular studies. So they defined mindfulness and mindful parenting. The Tai Chi base intervention is actually called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ne Yang Gong. And then acceptance commitment therapy, which is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. So this might be of interest to anyone who's maybe looking for a mind-body intervention, or if you are a mind-body practitioner and are looking to see if your particular modality could be helpful. But also that it should be well defined, hopefully, in the papers. So again, not to get in the weeds with these tables, but every systematic review should have a table that describes the study that was included in the review. So I just want to highlight a couple of things that one should be looking for in the table. So we have a column where it describes the studies and it has the author and the year. And we note here that all of these are very recent papers. The design of the study, the intervention description also includes the number of folks or participants that were involved in the study. And the years, age range, dropout rate. Not everybody includes dropout rate, but this is nice because it's important to know if actually if the ASD participants were able to finish the intervention. So for example, this was a pretty large 36% is a large dropout rate for only 14 people. So that's, you know, more than about a third, I guess, more than a third of participants dropped out. So they describe the outcomes, and we can see here that even you don't even have to read this stuff, but you can see that they all look different. So there's a variety of outcomes, which on the one hand, you want to evaluate the outcomes. Are these, are these valid outcomes? But also it makes it difficult because we can't compare these studies to each other because these guys are measuring apples and these guys are measuring oranges. So, but we can look at them on an individual basis. I wanted to also point out that they had, in this particular part of the table, they have an RCT, which is one of the stronger designs, and this is for their Tai Chi intervention. So this is the second part of the table. It continues because there were several. Again, these are very recent papers, so not a lot of research. Looks like there hasn't been a lot of research in before the year 2000. So here's another RCT, very young age. Here, the parents were trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and they observed the changes for children. And this is the last part of the study table. So I'm going to go and move on to the results. So they highlighted the results in several sections. The first one was mental and emotional health. So the RCT, one of the RCTs of an autism adapted mindfulness program showed moderate to large effect sizes for improving anxiety, depression, and rumination in adults. So that's nice. That's good to hear. It was a randomized control trial, so it does sound like it was a stronger design. So there was another mindfulness-based study that was not randomized that found some pre-post improvements happiness ratings and rumination. So the way I would interpret this, because it's pre-post and it doesn't have a control group, we can't determine, or we can't know if the changes were simply due to placebo or some other reason. It could be many things, but it does give us some preliminary evidence. So that shows that there's changes in the right direction, and so this can inform future larger studies. I do like that they included some anecdotal experience by one investigator that reported, I'm going to read it. One adolescent explained that his thoughts were like overcrowded subways in rush hour. In the My Mind training, he had learned to just be on the platform. Subways with many thoughts would still come to his platform, but he was now able to let them pass, to just observe them and stay calm. So I really love that they included this anecdotal experience, because even though it's anecdotal, it's a qualitative form of data that really gives us the story behind the numbers. It's not anything that we can show a p-value for or check for significance, but it shows that the participants' experience and can give some insight into how these things are really working and affecting the individual. So the next section was effects on behavior. Studies differed. The problem with some of these studies is they all differed with outcome measures, as I mentioned before, and intervention types. So we can't really compare between the studies, but we can talk about them on an individual basis. So the one study that did a yoga intervention, it was a randomized, they randomized school classrooms. So rather than randomizing an individual to a treatment, they took, they randomized the classroom, the whole classroom. So multiple classrooms. And they found significant changes in aberrant behaviors for the teacher rating, so the teachers gave ratings on changes and the parents gave ratings on changes, but the parents did not find, they did not find a significant change based on parent ratings, which that's an interesting story there, and it would be worth digging a little deeper. And if I wanted to know more, I would probably go to that, try to find that study and look a little deeper as to maybe why that is. So the Tai Chi version of the study, they compared, their control group was a progressive muscle relaxation therapy on self-control as measured by executive function, and that was significantly improved. And significant executive function is like cognitive control, basically. So a couple of parent-based intervention results. There's an RTT where parents were trained in MBSR, and it improved hyperactivity, but not other behaviors in children. And there was an uncontrolled parent-based intervention where they taught mindfulness to both parents and the children, and they found significant improvements in rumination and quality of life, but not in worry or mindfulness. So looking at this big picture again, so it's hard to compare across studies because they measure different things. But, you know, if a study finds a significant improvement in rumination and quality of life, but not on worry or mindfulness, you might wonder, like, what's the difference between rumination and worry, or, you know? So those are questions that as researchers we would ask. And maybe one question, the first thing that would come to mind is, what did they use to measure these constructs? Are those valid measures? And maybe there is worry, maybe worry improved, but they weren't able, they didn't have a sensitive enough, you know, questionnaire to pick that up. So those are just things to think about when you look at things like this. The other thing that they reported on was whether there was modifications of accessibility. And this I think is also important for mind-body practitioners or anyone that's really seeking out these kinds of treatments. When the researchers designed the studies, they had to make some modifications to make it more accessible to the ASD population. So some of the highlights are that some of the mind-body therapies used figurative language, which may be challenging to ASD folks, so they had to modify the languaging a little bit. Yeah, so they modified the language. They provided outline overviews of each session to the participants in advance, so they would feel more at ease and able to anticipate goals and tasks. They preferred silence during meditation rather than verbal guidance, which I found that to be interesting because a lot of people like the verbal guidance. Use smaller group sizes, and mindfulness exercises were shortened, and sensory sensitivities were added. So it's interesting also because it sort of speaks to how mind-body therapies aren't one size fits all, right? We actually have to modify it to fit the specific population. And for this specific population, these are the modifications that researchers did. So I thought that was interesting to include. So in conclusion, we're at early stages and more research is needed, obviously. So we that a lot of the research was fairly recent, which is great. It's recent, you know, it's the most recent, most up to date, but at the same time that they didn't find any, that there weren't any articles that were older, just goes to show that this is still really early stages for this particular avenue of research. And they looked at different therapies, different groups, different outcomes, so it's hard to really compare, but we do have a bird's eye view, and it's definitely a good place to start. They did show that it was feasible, so feasible means that they were able to implement these interventions safely and with the modifications that I mentioned. And it showed that there was a strong rationale for mind-body therapies to working with this group. So overall, I thought it was a pretty good, straightforward, systematic review. And I look forward to seeing what else they come up, what else researchers come up with. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. Bev, I don't know if you want to join back in for just a second, or. Oops. Hi, do you have any questions at all, or?
I thought it was interesting because your very first bullet in that last slide about the conclusion is more research needs to be done. It's almost always the conclusion. And,
yes.
and I guess when it is conclusive and exciting, that's when it hits the news.
Well, I don't think it's ever conclusive, but it hits the news regardless, like, because science is always a process. And, and as we find new information and new methodologies and new ways of measuring things and these kinds of things, we're always testing something new. So there's never really anything conclusive. But I mean, I think we've heard it before in the news, like coffee's good for you, coffee's not good for you, wine's good for you, wine's not good for you, so chocolate is good for you. Please let chocolate be good for me. So yeah, but it's true, because it's true for all, even yoga research. Some of the ones that have the most research, like acupuncture, has a huge body of evidence, but it's still very early stages relative to some, research, the history of research, so.
It also occurs to me that the act of researching anything it's a journey, because each step of the way you learn more about where you want to focus in next, and then you learn more from that one about where to focus in next. So seems like it takes a long time to actually get your original intention, your original question answered. And wow,
so
the expense and the time is
yes, it's very resource intensive. And you're right. I mean, one question leads to the next, and that's just part of the scientific process. But yeah, but it's true. I guarantee you, every systematic review that we review in Journal Club is probably going to end with more research is needed.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining. Do you have any other questions, or? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say to that, yeah, more research is needed, but the part of the outcome from this research is where to focus that.
Absolutely. So it helps folks refine and move forward. Mm-hmm. So it's like, building on each other. So anybody that wants to implement, so moving forward, anyone that wants to implement a yoga study, for example, mm-hmm. In ASD can look at the articles that were published, and maybe go back and look at some of the excluded ones if there's some in there, and say, okay, what's the next step? How do we do this differently? What outcomes do we want to zero in on? Maybe maybe they use different outcomes, things like that. So.
And unless you follow that sort of sequential or methodical trail, what you get is kind of what it looked like here. You get, when you go out and look at what's already out there, it's so disparate and so unfocused that it's very limited in its helpfulness, it seems like. Yeah. It might have just been the topic, but.
Maybe, yeah. So I think I'm open to anyone sending me topics. I'm going to post this on the YouTube channel, so folks can put comments there, or just go to the website. I'm trying to have comments open for each Journal Club entry, so that anyone can request a topic. But I think the next one I'm going to do, because it's been getting a lot of play in the news, is this yoga for chronic low back pain. And so I thought maybe we should take a look at one of those systematic reviews. So.
Yeah, that would be a big one. Seems like cancer would be a big one.
Cancer, yeah. Cancer survivors, and yeah.
anxiety and depression in general. And yeah, but I'd be curious to see what you get from those requests, where the
Yeah.
preponderance of the interest is.
I mean, would you have a preference for doing cancer? I mean, the next one or
Um,
whatever. I
I,
mean,
I would love to see anxiety.
okay.
Yeah, it's kind of close to my heart and to our work.
Okay.
So sure, since I get to make the choice, right?
Yeah. Let's do. I'll have to see what recent paper is out there. So
Sounds
great. Well,
great.
thanks a lot. Let me stop this